Good evening, dear friends. This is Franklin R. Ashwood, and you are most welcome here tonight.
Every week I think about you, the person on the other side. So tonight I'm asking, who are you? What keeps your hands busy during the day?
Tell me below.
And then,
Let us begin tonight's mystery.
The mill had been converted, but not entirely tamed. That was Miss Marple's first impression of Why Folly, that the house had been made comfortable against its will. The stone walls were too thick, the ceilings too low in some rooms, and cathedral high in others, and the water wheel outside continued its slow, deliberate turning regardless of the hour or the weather or the wishes of its owner. Sir Edmund Forley had installed electric lighting, a modern kitchen, and a telephone in the hall. The wheel turned anyway. Joan had warned her, of course. At Edmund is difficult, she'd said, which was Joan's way of saying something considerably worse. But Cecily will be glad of another woman there. She's rather, well, you'll see. Miss Marple had seen. Dinner on the first night was a careful meal, carefully prepared, carefully served, and eaten with the careful attention of people who were all, in their different ways, being careful. The dining room smelled of beeswax and river damp. 6 of them around the table. Sir Edmund at the head, naturally. Cecily on his left, her pearls too large for her neck. Roger across from her, in a suit that belonged in London. Diana Marsh at the far end, eating as though food were a practical matter, requiring no comment. Dr. Pelham beside Miss Marple, professionally pleasant, and Joan, who tried twice to start a conversation about autumn, and was both times gently and completely ignored. "The Hendersons have sold," said Roger, over the pheasant. "Of course they have," said Sir Edmund. "We Henderson was always going to sell. I said so in 48. Still, rather a shame. Is it?" Sir Edmund's eyes moved to his son with the particular attention of a man identifying an error. "Why?" Roger didn't answer. He reached for his wine. Miss Marple, who had been examining the salt cellar, Georgian slightly tarnished on one side as though it spent its life turned the same direction, looked up. She saw Cecily's hand move to her wedding ring and back to her lap. She saw Diana Marsh cut a precise piece of pheasant and not eat it. "What a lovely old house," said Miss Marple. "The wheel in particular. Does it serve any purpose still, or—" "None whatsoever," said Sir Edmund. "Ornamental. The previous owner was sentimental about it." "And you're not, Sir Edmund." He looked at her then, really looked, which most people at that table seemed to avoid doing. "I'm not sentimental about anything, Miss Marple." "How very practical," said Miss Marple. Ian returned to the salt cellar. After dinner the men had port. The women sat in the drawing-room with coffee going cold, and Miss Marple knitted and listened to Cecily describe a garden she'd planted, and Sir Edmund had altered without telling her. It had been a cutting garden, sweet peas, zinnias, things for the house. Now it was given over to roses, which Sir Edmund preferred, and which flowered once, and were then, in Cecily's phrase, just thorns until June. "I suppose it's his garden," said Joan helplessly. "Yes," said Cecily, "it is." Diana Marsh said nothing. She sat with a book open on her lap that she wasn't reading, and once, when Sir Edmund's voice carried from the study, some sharp word to Roger, the exact phrase lost through the wall, her hand tightened on the spine. Miss Marple noted this. She noted also that when Sir Edmund and Dr. Pelham returned to the drawing-room 20 minutes later, Pelham came first and made a small, barely visible gesture, no more than a tilt of the chin, in Miss Marple's direction. Preparing Sir Edmund, she rather thought. Telling him, "Be careful, there's an observant one." Sir Edmund had already been careful. Dr. Pelham was simply being more so. She could not sleep. The bedroom Joan had arranged for her was pleasant enough. A horsehair mattress, which she rather preferred, and a window looking out over the mill race. The water was black in the darkness, and the wheel turned and turned and turned, with a sound that was not quite mechanical and not quite natural. Something between. 2 o'clock, by the small travelling clock she kept on the nightstand. She lay and thought about Cecily's hands at dinner, about Roger's shoes, leather-soled, city shoes, inappropriate for the Herefordshire mud he'd have had to cross from the gate, which meant he'd arrived by the side path, the paved one, which meant he'd known the path was there, which meant he'd been recently enough to know the layout. Which was interesting given that he claimed he hadn't visited since the spring. Small things, that was all, that was always all. She thought about Diana Marsh's stillness. It wasn't the stillness of someone bored or someone comfortable. It was the stillness of someone who had decided, a long time ago, that the less they moved, the less they could be read. Miss Marple had known someone like that in St. Mary Mead. Old Croft the chemist, who kept his hands flat on the counter and his face pleasant, and was, for 11 years, the last person anyone would have suspected of anything. She had been wrong about Croft for 9 of those 11 years. The wheel turned. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. Footsteps on gravel. Careful footsteps, which is to say, not careful enough to be truly silent, only careful enough to seem as though they weren't trying to be. There is a difference. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know it. She did not get up. She lay still and listened to the mill race and counted the rotations of the wheel and waited, as she had always been good at waiting, for morning. Morning came grey and cold, with a mist off the river that turned the garden to shapes. It was Nora Gibb who found him. The sound she made was not precisely a scream. It was something more compressed than that. A single note of shock that hit the upstairs corridor and went through walls. Miss Marple was already awake. She heard doors open, heard Joan's voice, heard Roger say, "What is it? What's happened?" and put on her cardigan and her shoes with the efficiency of a woman who has never found it useful to lose her head. Sir Edmund Forley was in his library. He sat in the large leather chair behind the desk, as though he'd simply decided to stop. His face was slack, almost peaceful, in a way his face had never managed while he was living. The whisky decanter was on the desk, one glass, half full. The fire had burned to grey ash. Dr. Pelham was already there. Not almost there, not coming down the stairs, there, standing at the far side of the desk, his hand at Sir Edmund's wrist, his bag open on the side table. "Heart," he said without looking up. Poor Edmund, his heart was never strong. We all knew it might come to this. "Yes," said Miss Marple. She stood in the doorway and looked at Dr. Pelham's feet. His shoes had dew on them. Dew, on an October morning, burns off by 6 or is gone by the first hour of walking. It was now 6:45, and the mist was still on the garden, which meant the dew was still on the lawn. But on Dr. Pelham's shoes, his very clean, very sensible country shoes, the dew was already drying, and the faint grey tide mark of it sat perhaps an inch above the sole. He had been outside earlier, considerably earlier. "How very sad," said Miss Marple. "How long do you think he has been?" "Hours," said Pelham. "He'd have gone peacefully. In his sleep, practically." He looked up then. and his face was everything a doctor's face should be at such a moment. Composed, sorry, certain. There's no mystery here, I'm afraid. Miss Marple looked at the whiskey glass. She looked at the cold grate, and she looked at the window latch, which was fastened, and the sill below it, where the dust lay in an unbroken line except for one oval patch, perhaps the size of a palm, where something or someone had pressed. No, she said, I don't suppose there is. Inspector Slack arrived at 8:30 with mud on his boots and a theory already formed. This was, Miss Marple had observed over the years, Slack's primary investigative method. Arrive with the answer and arrange the facts around it. It saved time. It was also occasionally correct, which only encouraged him. Natural causes, he said in the library doorway. Dr. Pelham's confirmed it. Heart failure, known condition, no signs of disturbance. He had his notebook out, but he wasn't writing in it. I'll need statements from the household, where everyone was when they last saw Sir Edmund. Formality mostly. Of course, said Roger. He was standing by the fireplace with his arms crossed, as which people do when they want to appear calm and have not quite achieved it. His London shoes, Miss Marple noticed, had acquired mud since last night. He'd been in the garden this morning, or the yard. The paved path didn't have mud. She filed this carefully away. When did you last see your father, Mr. Fawley? After dinner. We had port together, him, Pelham, myself. I went up around 11. No reason to come back down? A pause, small, but there. No. Slack wrote something, Azure pretended to. And the others? Cecily gave her statement in the drawing-room, sitting very straight on the edge of the settee, her hands in her lap. She had not cried. Her face had the emptied look of someone who had used up a particular emotion some time ago and had none left for the occasion that actually called for it. I went up at 10, she said. Edmund stayed down. He often did. He liked the library late. Did you hear anything in the night? The wheel, she said. One always hears the wheel. Nothing else? She looked at the window. The garden was still grey, still shapeless with mist. No. It was, Miss Marple thought, a true answer. The problem was not what Cecily had heard. The problem was what she hadn't said, which was that she'd known, or suspected, or feared, and had gone to sleep anyway, with that knowledge folded under her like a stone. Miss Marple didn't press her. That wasn't her way, and she asked instead whether Cecily took milk in her coffee, and whether the roses outside were her doing. And Cecily said yes to the milk, and no to the roses, in a voice that contracted slightly around the second answer. And Miss Marple said, the previous owner, perhaps. And Cecily said Edmund, in a tone that contained a complete marriage. The library had been left to itself for the hour Slack spent taking statements elsewhere. Miss Marple went in. She was not searching precisely. She was looking, which is different. Searching implies you know what you want. Looking means you allow the room to tell you. The library was a working room, not decorated, but used. Shelves floor to ceiling, ledgers and legal volumes mixed with novels and field guides. A careless, inhabited arrangement that told you Sir Edmund actually read, rather than simply owning books. There was a reading stand by the window. There were 3 separate pairs of reading glasses in different locations, which told you he was the kind of man who refused to admit he needed them, and so kept them everywhere as a compromise. The whiskey decanter stood on the desk where it had been found. the glass beside it, half full. Miss Marple looked at the glass for a long time. Then she moved to the shelves, not searching, looking, and found what she was looking for in approximately 4 minutes. A leather diary, current year, kept not locked, but turned spine inward on the shelf. The way people hide things, they want private, but not inaccessible. She did not take it down. She simply tilted it enough to see the last few entries, which is a different thing and a distinction she found morally comfortable. October the 3rd, Pelham came by. Discussed the Harwich matter. He was nervous, which is unlike him. October the 9th, consulted Morrow in London. He confirms what I suspected. Have made arrangements accordingly. October the 12th, 4 days ago, will executed. Roger out. Everything to see Pelham does not know yet that I know what I know. This is, I think, sufficient protection. Men like Pelham are cowards at heart. Men like Pelham. Miss Marple set the diary back precisely as she'd found it. She stood for a moment looking at the window latch. Properly fastened, yes, but that oval absence in the dust on the outer sill remained, patient and factual. Someone had opened that window from the outside. Or perhaps she moved closer. She examined the latch mechanism. No, not from the outside. From the inside, to let someone in, and then fastened again after. The dust disturbance was from a hand reaching through a slightly opened window. Gloved, probably, which was why no fingerprint, but gloves have size, and the oval was not a large hand. She thought about Diana Marsh's hands. They were small. Then she thought, but Diana's motive died with Sir Edmund. A living Sir Edmund could be pressured, threatened, he eventually forced to acknowledge what she was. A dead Sir Edmund was simply a closed door. She moved away from the window. Nora Gibb was in the kitchen doing what Nora Gibb apparently did at all hours of difficulty, which was produce food. There were scones in the oven, a soup beginning on the range, and a quantity of sandwiches already wrapped and unnecessary on the counter. She was a broad woman with hazel eyes and a manner of speaking that deposited information sideways, or as though she hadn't quite meant to say it. "Terrible thing," said Nora, without turning from the range, "though I won't say it's a surprise. His heart's been poorly these 3 years." Yes, Dr. Pelham mentioned his heart. Dr. Pelham. She adjusted something on the range. Well, he would know, wouldn't he? Miss Marple sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which was the correct approach with Nora Gibb. Being invited would have made it formal. Formal meant less said. And she accepted the tea that appeared as if by reflex and said, "I imagine you've been with the family some time." 14 years. Sir Edmund and the first Mrs. Fawley, then, well. A pause containing an entire opinion of Cecily. Then after. It must have been quite a change. The house, the arrangement. Every house changes, said Nora, in a tone of someone who has made her peace with more than one thing. He changed the study round twice. The garden, that was the 3rd year, took out the cutting garden and put in roses. She cried about that. Not unkindly, a statement of fact. Men like things their way. And Miss Marsh, has she been here long? Nora was quiet for a moment. The scones smelled of currant and warm butter. 8 months. She came in March. Another pause. He advertised for a secretary. There were others applied, I believe. He chose her. She seems very capable. She is, said carefully, and as though capable were a word that covered several things Nora wasn't going to say. Miss Marple let the silence sit. Silence, with people like Nora, was productive. "He had a visitor," said Nora presently. "6 weeks ago, a doctor from London. Not Dr. Pelham, someone else. Dr. Morrow, I think the name was. Stayed 2 hours in the study. Left without tea, which I thought rude." She moved the scones. "And then 3 days later, Sir Edmund went to see the solicitor in Hereford. Didn't take Miss Marsh to drive him. Took himself, which he hadn't done in months on account of his eyes. Did he? Came back in a, well, not a good mood exactly. More like a decided mood, if you know what I mean." Miss Marple did know, precisely. "And Dr. Pelham," she said, as though the thought had just arrived. "He came often, every week, regular as the wheel." Nora set a scone in front of Miss Marple without asking. "Yesterday he came at 4, stayed until 6, and they were in the study." "Just the 2 of them?" "Just the 2. And this morning, when did he arrive?" Nora turned from the range. Her brown eyes, they were brown now, in this light Miss Marple noted, were thoughtful. "He said he came at 6:40, when Mr. Roger raised the alarm." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that's what he said." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to the range. "The soup needs watching." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I'm sure it does." She finished her tea and thought about a chemist she had known in St. Mary Mead, who had also been always first at the scene, always ready with an explanation, and who had, in the end, been first at the scene because he had made the scene. People trusted a kind face more than they should. Kindness and goodness were not the same thing. They never had been. Roger was in the garden. This struck Miss Marple as odd. Not the garden itself, but the manner of it, that he wasn't walking, wasn't thinking walking the way people do when grief or shock sends them outside. He was standing at the far edge of the dead rose beds, with his back to the house and his hands in his pockets, staring at the river. Quite still, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace but from a decision already made. She watched him from the morning room window for 3 minutes. He didn't move. Then Joan appeared at her elbow with more tea that Miss Marple didn't need and said, "Poor Roger. They didn't get on, but still, one's father." She said it with the gentle authority of someone who has processed the situation and arrived at a respectable conclusion. Joan was good at that. "Did they get on very badly?" said Miss Marple. "Edmund was, well." Joan sat down, which meant she was going to say something real. "He was the sort of man who kept score. Everything Roger did wrong, he kept and brought out at the right moment." She wrapped both hands around her cup. Roger borrowed money 3 years ago. Edmund lent it, and never once, in 3 years, let Roger forget the shape of it." "How much?" Joan blinked. "I don't know exactly. A good deal, I think." "And was it repaid?" No, I don't think so." She paused. "Does it matter?" "I've no idea," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I just find money clarifying, as a subject." She found Roger still outside 20 minutes later. She went through the back, along the flagged path that skirted the kitchen garden, was dead and brown now, the last of the season's beans still rattling dry on their canes. The river smell was strong, mud and cold water, and something green underneath. He heard her coming. He turned. Up close, Roger Forley looked less like a man who'd lost his father, and more like a man who'd lost a bet. His face was tight around the eyes, the particular tightness of someone calculating. Miss Marple. Not unwelcoming, but not warm. Cold morning to be outside. I find I think better in cold air, she said, which was true. You? He laughed, a short sound that wasn't quite humourless. Not thinking, really, just standing. She looked at the river. The water wheel, visible from here, turned its slow rotation, indifferent. You must have known this house well growing up. I grew up in Wiltshire mostly. Boarded at 12. This was Edmund bought Why Folly when I was 26. It was never home. Particularly. And yet you came for the weekend. A small pause. He asked me. He liked to. He wanted people around him, or near him. I'm not sure he particularly wanted them with him. He said this with the accuracy of someone who has thought it out over many years. There's a difference. Yes, said Miss Marple, there is. The river slid past. A heron stood on the opposite bank, ridiculous and patient. Mr. Fawley, she said in the manner of someone making light conversation, your father changed his will recently, I understand. Roger went very still. Not like Diana Marsh's stillness. That was controlled, architectural. This was the stillness of a man who touched something unexpectedly hot. What makes you say that? Oh, something Nora mentioned. The solicitor's visit. She smiled at the heron. I'm afraid I'm terribly nosy. One of my great failings. He was quiet for a moment. Then, it doesn't matter. He changed it back and forth 3 times in the last 2 years. It was how he communicated, his opinion of you, at any given moment. A brief, unpleasant smile. I expect I'm out. I've been out before. That must be, Miss Marple said carefully, rather wearing. Yes. Roger looked at the water. Yes, was. He seemed to remember, belatedly, that his father was dead. Something moved across his face, not grief, but something adjacent to it. Regret, perhaps, as for a different sort of father, the one that might have been, God, yes, she left him there. The heron didn't move. Diana Marsh was in the upstairs corridor, not doing anything. That was the first thing. She was simply standing near the window at the corridor's end, looking out at the drive, her arms at her sides. She heard Miss Marple's step on the stairs and turned, and her face was absolutely composed. Not numb, not the composure of shock. Composed, managed, Miss Marple. A half nod, which she made to move past. Miss Marsh. Miss Marple did not move from the top of the stairs. Not blocking precisely, just present. I wonder if you might spare a few minutes. A slight hesitation. I have letters to deal with. Sir Edmund's correspondence. Yes, I imagine there's a great deal to handle. You must have been invaluable to him. Something moved behind Diana's eyes. There and gone. I tried to be useful. 8 months, or Nora tells me. Yes, you must know the house very well. Well enough. The library, for instance. Miss Marple said this as though it were nothing. The same voice she'd used to ask about the roses. He spent his evenings there, I think. It must have been. He must have been fond of the room. He worked there, said Diana. I don't know that he was fond of anything. She said it with such precision that Miss Marple stopped. It wasn't bitterness, or rather, it was old bitterness. I settled down to something quieter. Something that had been examined and accepted. I'm sorry, said Miss Marple. Diana looked at her. Just looked for a moment with those careful, measuring eyes. Are you? I think, said Miss Marple, that his death must be complicated for you. A long silence, long enough to be uncomfortable. Diana Marsh was not, Miss Marple thought, a woman who found silence uncomfortable. She used it the way others used furniture to arrange the room. Complicated, she said finally. Yes, that's one word. She moved past and Miss Marple let her. Inspector Slack found Miss Marple in the morning room at noon, knitting. He had the look of a man who has completed a task to his satisfaction. Statements taken, no indication of anything untoward. Dr. Pelham signed the death certificate. He said this last with the air of presenting a trophy. Heart failure, as expected. Yes, said Miss Marple. Her needles clicked. Careful, careful. Inspector, can I ask you something quite trivial? If it's quick. When Dr. Pelham arrived this morning, I was a little confused about the time. Someone said 6:40, but I rather thought 6:42, said Slack. Answered the telephone in his cottage at 6:38 when Mr. Roger called. 4 minutes to drive over, straightforward. He drove, yes. Ah, I had thought, but never mind, she smiled. One's memory at my age. Slack made a noise that was not quite dismissive and not quite polite. He left. Miss Marple set down her knitting. She thought about this for a moment with the specific, unhurried attention she gave to things that mattered. Dr. Pelham had driven 4 minutes from his cottage to Millhouse at 6:42, yet his shoes had the dried tide mark of dew that had been walked through earlier, considerably earlier, when the dew was still heavy, which before 5:30 at the latest. You could drive to a house without walking across a dewy lawn. You could not walk across a dewy lawn without acquiring dew on your shoes. So he had been here earlier, on foot, before the telephone call. Which meant either he had walked over for a reason before Roger telephoned, or Roger's telephone call was not what had brought him. She picked up her knitting again. Careful, she thought. Be careful. That was the word for this house, for these people, and for all of it. Everyone here had been careful. Sir Edmund had been careful, careful enough to note in his diary that Pelham was a coward at heart, careful enough to think that knowing the secret was sufficient protection. He had been wrong about that. Careful people were not always safe people. They were sometimes simply the people who knew what they were doing. It was Nora, in the end, who gave her the last piece. Not deliberately. That wasn't Nora's way. Nora Gibb gave information the way the river gave up things it had swallowed. Reluctantly, sideways, when the current shifted. She came to collect the tea things at 3 and said, while stacking cups with her back to the room, Dr. Pelham was here yesterday, as I said, 4 till 6. But he also stopped by the day before, Tuesday. Did he often come twice in a week? Not often. Sometimes when Sir Edmund when things were uncertain. Medically. She stacked the last cup. He left Tuesday evening and I was clearing the study and I found... She stopped. Yes, Miss Marple's voice. Warm, patient. The voice that had been opening doors for 60 years. I found a small bottle, on the floor by the chair leg. Dropped, I thought. Maybe from his bag. I left it on the desk. Thought Sir Edmund would know to give it back. And was it gone the next morning? Nora turned and looked at her fully. Really looked. Her expression was that of a woman who has been not thinking something for approximately 18 hours. It was gone? Yes, said Miss Marple. I rather thought it might be. She said it quietly, with no drama, the way you might confirm that rain was coming because the clouds were right. She picked up her knitting and began another row, and the needles moved, careful, 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 and the mill wheel turned outside. And Nora Gibb stood with the tea tray in her broad hands and said nothing at all. Some things don't need to be said. That's the mercy of them, and the horror. The afternoon went grey, and then greyer. By 2 o'clock the mist had returned, not the clean morning kind that burns away, but the heavy, settled kind that means to stay. The river disappeared. The water wheel turned in a white nothing, its sound more present without its shape. Why Folly drew in around itself, of the way old houses do in bad weather, and the lights came on in the rooms and made everything smaller and more particular. Miss Marple sat in the library. She had asked very politely whether she might sit there for an hour. She had explained that she found libraries soothing at difficult times, which was true as far as it went. Joan had said of course, and Inspector Slack had gone by then, and no one else had any claim on the room. The body had been removed at 11. The chair remained, and which some people would have found disturbing. Miss Marple did not. A chair was a chair. She did not sit in it. She sat instead in the smaller chair by the cold window, with her knitting in her lap and her eyes moving slowly around the room the way water moves when it's finding a level. The books first. She had already noted the diary, spine turned inward, third shelf, legal section. She did not touch it again, as what she was looking for now was not what Sir Edmund had written, but what someone else had left. Diana Marsh had been in this library. 8 months of it, filing, sorting, managing correspondence. She would know every shelf. What does a woman leave in a room where she has no power? What does she keep that she cannot keep anywhere else? Miss Marple thought about this. Then she rose, carefully, her hip was difficult in cold weather, and went to the shelves on the library's far wall, to the ones away from the desk, the ones a secretary would have no professional reason to arrange. She found it in 11 minutes. Not because she was clever. She would have objected to that word, had anyone used it. Because she had known a woman in St. Mary Mead who kept her private letters behind the encyclopedias in her late husband's study. And that woman had also been a woman with no room of her own in a house that was not hers. And the encyclopedias were the logical choice because no one opened them. And the logic of desperation has a limited vocabulary and tends to repeat itself across decades and counties and entirely different lives. Third shelf from the bottom. The encyclopedias, Britannica, old edition K through M, behind the M volume. 2 letters, both in Sir Edmund's handwriting. That heavy, deliberate script she'd seen in the diary. She didn't remove them from behind the book, and she simply tilted the volume forward enough to read. The first letter was dated March, the month Diana had arrived. Short, I know who you are. I have known since August of last year, when your mother's solicitor made inquiries. I propose no difficulty provided you continue in your present capacity and make no claims of any nature. If this arrangement suits you, we need not discuss it further. No salutation, no signature. He hadn't needed one. The second letter was more recent. October, 2 weeks ago. My arrangements have changed. You will find when the time comes that I have been fair. Fairer than you had reason to expect. I ask only your continued discretion, which I believe you are capable of. Miss Marple stood very still with the book tilted in her hand, and read the second letter twice. Fairer than you had a reason to expect. He had put her in the will. After changing it, after Roger was removed, after Cecily received everything, he had, somewhere in those arrangements, included Diana. A man like Sir Edmund Forley did not do this from guilt, or not only from guilt. He did it because he had decided Diana was no threat to him, because she would stay quiet and stay useful, and he would have the pleasure of controlling what she received and when. She had not killed him. She had been waiting. And now the will would speak for him, since he could not, and Diana would get whatever he had decided she deserved. Oh, and there was nothing she could do about the amount or the conditions, and she knew it, and she had accepted it. And she was the kind of woman who could accept a terrible thing with perfect stillness, because the alternative was worse. Poor child, thought Miss Marple. And then, no, she is not poor. She is simply in the position that women have always been put in, and she has handled it with more intelligence than most. She set the encyclopedia back precisely as she'd found it. Outside, or the river. She put on her coat and her scarf, the green one Joan had given her 2 Christmases ago, slightly too long, which she had never mentioned, and went into the garden through the side door. The dead rose beds were to her left. Thorns on grey canes, no colour. The river was somewhere beyond the mist, audible, invisible. The wheel turned. She walked slowly, not because she needed to think, but because thinking, for Miss Marple, it had always been a physical process. It happened in the feet as much as the head, in the rhythm of movement, in the cold air finding the gaps in one's coat. She thought about Dr. Pelham, Hugo Pelham, 50 years old, a comfortable face, professionally warm. He had been Sir Edmund's doctor for how long? Nora would know. Long enough to be trusted. Long enough that his presence at Millhouse would cause no comment, at any hour, for any reason. A medical bag contains many things, most of them innocent. Potassium chloride is not a sinister substance in isolation. It has entirely legitimate uses. It also, administered in sufficient quantity to a man with a compromised heart, causes cardiac arrest with very little trace, particularly if the post-mortem is not looking for it, particularly if the examining doctor has already signed a death certificate for natural causes before anyone thinks to look. Before anyone thinks to look. She stopped walking. October the 3rd. Pelham came by, discussed the Harwich matter. He was nervous, which is unlike him. What was the Harwich matter? She didn't know the specifics and didn't need to. She knew the shape of it. Sir Edmund had been a magistrate for 30 years. Cases came through his hands, evidence, testimony, the private knowledge that accumulates in a man who sits in judgment long enough. He had found out something about Pelham. Something from years ago. A patient, a mistake, an outcome that should have been examined and wasn't. And Pelham had been nervous. Men like Pelham are cowards at heart. There it was. Not cruelty exactly. Sir Edmund hadn't been cruel in the simple sense. He'd been something more precise than cruel. He'd been a collector. He collected people's weak points and held them, not always using them, but keeping them. The possession was enough. The power of knowing. But this time he had miscalculated, and he had written in his diary that knowing was sufficient protection. He had believed that Pelham, being a coward, would not act. He had believed cowardice was predictable, that a coward always runs rather than fights. He had forgotten, or never learned, that a coward, cornered completely, becomes capable of things a braver man would hesitate to do, precisely because they are afraid, precisely because they cannot afford to be found out. Precisely because the alternative, exposure, ruin, or the dismantling of 50 years of careful building, was worse than the act itself. A brave man might have confessed. walked away, taken his consequences. Pelham had put potassium chloride in a whiskey glass and walked away from that instead. Old Croft. She hadn't thought about him in years, and now she'd thought about him twice in 2 days, which meant something. The mind doesn't repeat itself without reason. Edgar Croft, the chemist on the High Street in St. Mary Mead. 30 years she'd known him, or believed she'd known him, which is not the same thing. A distinction she'd learned at considerable cost. He had been the first at every scene of trouble in the village. The Hargreaves girl's illness, the question of what had been in old Mr. Pemberton's tea, the business with the vicar's wife, and the sleeping powders. Always there, always calm, always the voice of reasonable explanation. For 9 years she had thought him merely useful, a man who turned up. The community-minded. In the 10th year she had begun to wonder. In the 11th year she had been certain, and had said so to Inspector Murchison, who had not believed her for another 8 months. Croft had trusted his own careful face too completely. Pelham had done the same. There is a particular confidence that grows in men who are trusted professionally. Doctors, pharmacists, clergymen, solicitors. The world has agreed to trust them, and after sufficient years, they begin to trust their own untouchability. They forget that trust is not a permanent condition. They forget that small women who knit in corners are sometimes doing something other than knitting. She turned back toward the house. The mist was, if anything, thicker. Why Folly was a shape, a suggestion, lamplight in the lower windows, the dark suggestion of the mill wheel's rotation. She thought he had come the night before on foot. Through the garden, in the dark, he knew this garden, knew the path, knew which window Sir Edmund kept unfastened after 10 o'clock in the months when he liked air. He had come in through the library window, leaving the print of his palm in the dust of the outer sill. He had stood before a man who trusted him completely, because Sir Edmund trusted his own power over Pelham more than he trusted any threat, and he had put something in a half-finished glass of whiskey and left the way he came, and unlatched the window behind him from the inside with the careful reach that left one clean oval in the dust, and gone home in the dark. And then at 6:38, when Roger Forley raised the alarm, he had dressed and driven 4 minutes up the road, and arrived with wet shoes from a lawn. He had no reason to have walked across that morning, because he had walked across it hours before in the dark, and the dew mark of it had dried to a waterline on the leather, and he had not noticed, or had not thought anyone else would. He had not thought about Miss Marple. Most people didn't. She found this, generally speaking, very useful. She came in through the side door and stood in the flagged passage, unwinding Joan's too long scarf, and she thought, I am as certain as I have ever been. Now what does one do with certainty? Not rush, never rush. Rushing was for people who were afraid of losing something. She was not afraid of losing this. Pelham was not going anywhere. His whole life was staying in one place and being trusted. He could not afford to run. Running would itself be admission, and he hadn't run from anything in 50 years. He would stay and be helpful and speak well at the funeral, and his face would do what it had always done, and he would believe he was safe. Let him believe it a little longer. She needed one more thing, one small confirmation, not for herself, but for Inspector Slack, who would not be moved by boot dew and diary entries, and the particular quality of a man who arrived too smoothly at too many scenes. Slack needed something he could put in his notebook and underline. She needed that vial. Nora had described it. Small glass, dropped on the floor by the chair leg. Left on the desk, gone by morning. A medical vial, the kind that fits in a bag without comment, or that you remove without thinking and replace without thinking and never notice is missing until someone asks. Someone would need to ask. She folded the scarf over the hook by the door, straightened her cardigan, and went to find Inspector Slack. She found Slack in the hall, putting on his coat. "Inspector," said Miss Marple, "before you go, I wonder if you might ask Dr. Pelham one small question." Slack paused, one arm in, one arm out. "Miss Marple, about his bag?" She said it pleasantly, and as though suggesting he try the scones. Specifically, whether he might be missing a small glass vial. Medical, I believe. Nora found one on the study floor Tuesday evening and left it on the desk. It was gone by Wednesday morning. Slack looked at her. He had the expression he always got, that specific, involuntary expression of a man who doesn't want to be interested and is. "And why," he said carefully, "would a missing vial be relevant to a cardiac event?" "Oh, it probably isn't," said Miss Marple. "I just find it untidy. Loose ends bother me. At my age, one has so few distractions." A long pause, his coat half on. "I'll ask him," said Slack. Pelham was in the sitting room. He'd been there most of the afternoon, present, available, appropriately subdued. A doctor at a death is never out of place, and Pelham had arranged himself within that logic with the ease of long practice. He rose when Slack came in. He nodded to Miss Marple, who had followed at a small distance, as though she'd simply happened to be walking in the same direction. "Doctor." Slack had his notebook out. A formality, he'd have said if asked. "Small matter. One of the household staff found a medical vial in the study Tuesday evening. Left it on the desk. You wouldn't know anything about that." Pelham's face did what it always did. Composed itself. Warm, certain. "A vial? I do sometimes carry samples. Standard practice. I may well have dropped something without noticing. I can check my bag if you—" "Please," said Slack. The bag was on the chair beside him. He opened it with the unhurried movement of a man who has nothing to hide, which is different from a man who has nothing to hide, though the motion is identical. He looked through it, looked again. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, had stopped, just for a moment. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. Then they resumed their movement through the bag's contents, but the rhythm had changed, just fractionally, just enough, from the rhythm of a man searching to the rhythm of a man calculating. "Odd," he said, "I don't seem to—" "Potassium chloride," said Miss Marple. She said it from the doorway, in the same voice she used to identify the correct bus at St. Mary Mead's single stop. Informative? Mild? Pelham looked up. And there it was. That was all. Just a look. Just the eyes. Just the fraction of a second before the professional face reassembled itself. But Miss Marple had been watching for it, and she saw it, and it was enough. Not guilt exactly. Recognition. The specific recognition of a man who has walked a long, careful road in darkness, and looked up to find someone standing at the end of it with a lamp. "I beg your pardon," he said. "The vial," said Miss Marple. "I thought it might be potassium chloride. Given Sir Edmund's cardiac history, It would be entirely explicable in a doctor's bag. And yet, she paused. Her knitting needles were in her hands. She didn't remember picking them up. A man with Sir Edmund's condition, who had been told categorically to avoid whiskey, and had noted this in his own diary quite specifically, would not have poured himself a drink at midnight. He was careful about his health. He was careful about everything. Slack was very still. Pelham said nothing. "The window as well," said Miss Marple, almost to herself. "The dust on the outer sill. And your shoes this morning, Dr. Pelham, the dew line. One walks across a wet lawn, and the dew dries to a mark about so high." She indicated with one needle, an inch above the floor. "Yours had dried considerably by 6:42, which suggests you walked across that lawn rather earlier. Before 5, I should think, when it was dark." The fire ticked. Somewhere outside the wheel. "This is—" Pelham began, and then stopped. He was a man who had built his entire life on the right words arriving at the right moment. And the words had not arrived. "The Harwich matter," said Miss Marple gently. "Sir Edmund knew, and you knew he knew, and when he changed his will last week and brought in a London physician, and you understood that the information might not stay private. Well." She looked at him with something that was not sympathy, but was not without it. "You were afraid. I understand that. Fear makes people do things that nothing else could." Slack found his voice. "Dr. Pelham, it was 1947. Pelham said it to the floor. Quietly, with the particular quietness of a thing that has been held a long time. "A woman named Grace Alderton. I misread the symptoms. I was exhausted. There had been 4 calls the night before, and I misread them. She died of what I should have caught." He stopped. "Edmund was the magistrate at the inquiry. There was no formal finding against me. But he kept the file. He kept everything," said Miss Marple. "Yes, a breath. He called me in October and said his new physician had found something in his records, my records, an anomaly in the treatment notes. He said he wanted to discuss it." The professional voice, crumbling now at the edges. "He wasn't threatening me. He didn't need to threaten. He simply wanted me to know that he knew. That was enough for Edmund. That was always enough." "But not this time," said Slack. I couldn't—" He stopped again, pulled himself back, one last time, into something resembling composure. It didn't fit any more. "I couldn't go through another inquiry. I'm 50 years old. I couldn't." The room was very quiet. "No," said Miss Marple, "I don't suppose you could." She said it without judgment. That wasn't her role, and had never been. Her role was the seeing of things, the lamp at the end of the road. What happened in the light was someone else's business, and they took him just before dark. Slack was correct about procedure. At least, he called for a post-mortem, called for analysis of Sir Edmund's whisky glass, which had not yet been washed, because Nora Gibb, to her great credit, had felt in her bones that it shouldn't be. And by 7 o'clock there were 2 constables at Y Folly, and Dr. Hugo Pelham was in the back of a car going toward Hereford with his comfortable face finally, irrevocably still. Cecily left the following morning, and she packed a single case, which told you something, and said goodbye to Nora, which told you something else, and did not look at the library as she passed it in the hall. Miss Marple was in the morning room and heard the front door and the car on the gravel, and then nothing. She hoped Cecily went somewhere with a cutting garden. Sweet peas, zinnias, things that came back every year without being told to. Diana Marsh left without saying goodbye to anyone. Miss Marple saw her from the upstairs window, the same window Diana had stood at, looking out at the drive. She watched the taxi come, watched Diana put one bag in the boot with the efficient, minimal movements of a woman who had learned to travel light, because lightness was survival. She did not look up. Miss Marple had not expected her to. The will, when read, would show that Sir Edmund had left Diana a sum, not generous but not nothing, controlled from beyond the grave, characteristically. And Diana would take it or contest it, and either way she would manage, because she was that sort of person. The sort the world underestimates and is occasionally surprised by. Roger stayed. The house was his now, such as it was. Miss Marple passed him in the hall on her last morning, and he was standing with a cup of coffee, looking at the wall as though recalculating something. And she thought, he will sell it eventually, and the wheel will turn for whoever comes next, and Nora Gibb will make scones and keep counsel and outlast them all. Joan came to collect her with the car at 9. "Are you all right?" Joan asked at the gate. She always asked and always meant it, which was one of Joan's reliable virtues. "Perfectly," said Miss Marple. "It's a sad business, but then most of it is." She did not look back at the house. She looked at the river, briefly visible from the gate, brown and unhurried, and at the edge of the wheel completing its rotation, up, over, down, into the water, up again, not sentimental, still turning. She got into the car and picked up her knitting from the seat where she'd left it, and found the row she'd been working on for 3 days, the careful row she kept returning to, and continued it. Joan drove. The mill disappeared behind the trees. The needles moved, and